The river was calm, deceptively calm. 300,000 soldiers of the Sui dynasty stood along its banks, their armor glinting in the summer sun of 612 AD. Banners stretched as far as the eye could see, yellow silk emblazoned with the imperial dragon, symbols of an empire that had conquered kingdoms and crushed rebellions. They were the largest invasion force ever assembled in East Asian history, and they had marched for months across hostile terrain to reach this moment. Across the Salsu River, hidden in the forests and hills of Goguryeo, 5,000 defenders watched in silence. They were outnumbered 60 to 1. By every measure of conventional warfare, they should have been annihilated. But they possessed something the massive Sui army did not: knowledge of the land, patience forged in desperation, and a plan so audacious that history would remember it as one of the most devastating military catastrophes ever recorded. This is the story of the Battle of Salsu River, where engineering became warfare, where patience destroyed power, and where an entire empire's ambition drowned in a single catastrophic moment. The year was 612 AD, and the Korean peninsula stood on the edge of obliteration. The Sui dynasty, having recently reunified China after centuries of division, turned its gaze eastward toward the ancient kingdom of Goguryeo. For Emperor Yang of Sui, this was more than territorial expansion. It was about legacy, about proving that his dynasty could achieve what even the mighty Han dynasty had failed to accomplish. Goguryeo was one of the three kingdoms of Korea, occupying the northern Korean peninsula and parts of Manchuria. It was a warrior kingdom, battle-hardened by centuries of conflict with nomadic tribes and Chinese dynasties. Its people were fiercely independent, its fortresses legendary, and its military traditions sophisticated. But by 612, it faced an existential threat unlike anything it had encountered before. Emperor Yang assembled an invasion force that defied imagination. Historical records speak of over 1 million soldiers, though modern historians estimate the actual combat force at around 300,000, with the rest being support personnel, laborers, and supply train workers. Even at the conservative estimate, it was a force large enough to make the earth tremble as it marched. The Sui strategy was brutal in its simplicity, overwhelming force applied at multiple points simultaneously. Naval forces would attack from the sea, while the main army would drive through Goguryeo's northern defenses, capture the capital of Pyongyang, and force complete submission. The sheer size of the force was meant to be psychological warfare in itself. Resistance would be futile, surrender inevitable. But Goguryeo's King Yanjiang and his brilliant military commander, General Yulji Mundiak, had no intention of surrendering. They understood they could not defeat the Sui in open battle. The numbers were simply too overwhelming. So they crafted a different kind of war, one that would use the invaders' size and confidence against them. The Sui invasion began in spring, a massive multi-pronged assault that initially met with some success. Fortresses along the border held out longer than expected, bleeding the Sui forces through prolonged sieges, but eventually, several fell. The Sui army pushed deeper into Goguryeo territory, their supply lines stretching dangerously thin across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. General Yulji Mundiak implemented what would later be called a scorched earth strategy combined with strategic harassment. Goguryeo forces avoided major engagements, instead launching hit-and-run attacks on Sui supply columns, poisoning wells, burning crops, and destroying infrastructure. The massive Sui army, which needed enormous quantities of food and water daily, began to suffer logistical strain. But Yulji Mundiak was playing a longer game. He allowed the Sui forces to advance, even appeared to retreat before them, drawing them deeper into Goguryeo territory and further from their supply bases. He sent false messages indicating willingness to negotiate, buying time while secretly preparing for the decisive blow. The Sui commanders, frustrated by the lack of a major battle and confident in their overwhelming numbers, pressed forward. Their target remained the capital, Pyongyang, but between them and that prize lay the Salsu River, a significant waterway that would require a major crossing operation. This is where General Yulji Mundiak had been leading them all along. The Salsu River, known today as the Cheongshan River in North Korea, was a substantial waterway that cut through the landscape like a natural fortress. In summer, its waters ran swift but manageable. It was wide enough to require careful crossing, but not so treacherous as to be impassable for a well-organized army. But General Yulji Mundiak saw something the Sui commanders did not: potential. For weeks, while the Sui forces were engaged in sieges and marching through Goguryeo territory, teams of engineers and workers had been laboring upstream. Far from the sight of any Sui scouts, in a narrow gorge where the river passed between steep hills, they constructed a massive dam. This was not a crude barrier of logs and earth. It was a sophisticated engineering project, built with timber reinforcements, packed earth, and stone, designed to hold back the river's flow and create an enormous reservoir behind it. The dam was hidden from downstream view by the terrain and camouflaged to appear as natural as possible to any observer who might approach from below. The construction took weeks of backbreaking labor. Thousands of workers toiled in shifts, many of them civilians who understood that their nation's survival depended on completing this project. Trees were felled and shaped into massive support beams. Earth was excavated and packed into barriers. Stone was quarried and fitted into place. Crucially, the dam was designed with controlled weak points, sections that could be deliberately destroyed when the moment came, allowing a catastrophic release rather than a gradual overflow. Teams of engineers studied the structure daily, calculating water pressure, testing release mechanisms, and preparing for the single moment when this weapon of mass destruction would be unleashed. Meanwhile, downstream at the actual river crossing point, Goguryeo forces made their own preparations. They fortified positions on the far bank, but deliberately kept their visible strength minimal. They wanted to appear weak enough that the Sui would commit to the crossing. Hidden in forests and ravines on the far side were the bulk of Yulji Mundiak's 5,000 warriors, ready to emerge when the trap was sprung. Scouts reported every movement of the Sui army's approach. Messengers maintained constant communication between the river crossing, the upstream dam, and General Yulji Mundiak's command position. Timing would be everything. Release the flood too early, and the Sui might avoid crossing. Too late, and too many would make it safely across. Everything had to be perfect. The Sui army reached the Salsu River in late summer. 300,000 men stretched along the riverbank for miles, an endless sea of soldiers, horses, and supply wagons. Their commanders surveyed the crossing point and saw what they expected: a manageable river, light defensive positions on the far bank, and no sign of a major Goguryeo force. They ordered the crossing to begin. The Sui employed the standard tactics for a large river crossing. Engineers went first, testing depths and establishing rope lines. Then advance infantry units waded across, shields held high, ready to secure the far bank. Cavalry waited for their turn, horses stamping nervously at the water's edge. The initial crossing met little resistance. A few arrows from Goguryeo defenders, easily answered by Sui archers. Skirmishes along the far bank that seemed half-hearted, as if the defenders were already retreating. To the Sui commanders, it appeared that General Yulji Mundiak had made a strategic error, caught with the river at his back and unable to mount an effective defense. Emboldened, the Sui commanders committed more forces to the crossing. Thousands of soldiers entered the water, the river rising to their chests as they pushed across. The current was manageable, the footing secure enough. Officers shouted orders, maintaining formation even in the water. This was proceeding exactly as planned. More units entered the river. The center of the Sui army was now committed to the crossing, tens of thousands of men in the water or on the far bank, with tens of thousands more waiting their turn on the near bank. The army was at its most vulnerable, split by the natural barrier of the river. General Yulji Mundiak watched from a hilltop several miles away, receiving constant updates from messengers. He waited until the reports confirmed what he needed to hear. The bulk of the Sui force was committed, strung out across the river and the banks, their formation broken by the crossing operation. He gave the order. A messenger raced upstream to the dam. There, teams of engineers with axes, hammers, and pry bars attacked the predetermined weak points in the structure. The timber groaned. Packed earth began to shift. Water pressure, building for weeks behind the massive barrier, found the openings. And then the dam exploded. It wasn't a gradual collapse. It was a catastrophic failure. a wall of water 10 feet high roaring down the river valley with the force of nature's fury unleashed. The sound was like thunder, audible for miles, a deep rumbling roar that grew louder with every second. The Sui soldiers in the river didn't understand what was happening at first. The water level began to rise rapidly, inches becoming feet in seconds. The current, which had been manageable moments before, became a raging torrent. Men lost their footing, were swept off their feet, disappeared beneath the churning surface. And then they saw it. The wall of water rounded the bend upstream, a massive surge that filled the entire river valley. Trees, boulders, debris, all carried along in its devastating embrace. There was no time to run, no time to swim, no time even to scream. The flood hit the main body of troops with apocalyptic force. Thousands of soldiers simply vanished, swept away instantly, armor dragging them beneath the surface. Horses tumbled like toys in the current. Supply wagons disintegrated. The carefully maintained formation dissolved into chaos as the river became a killing field. Those who had already crossed to the far bank watched in horror as their comrades drowned by the thousands. Those still on the near bank saw the center of their army annihilated before their eyes. The flood was so sudden, so complete, that there was nothing anyone could do but watch the devastation unfold. For several minutes, the river became an impassable torrent, filled with debris, bodies, and the wreckage of an army. The roar of the water drowned out all other sounds, the screams, the shouts, the desperate calls for help. When the initial surge finally passed, the river remained swollen and swift, impassable for an army. The Sui force was now split into two separated groups, unable to support each other, with the communication and supply chain completely severed. And that's when General Yulji Mundiak's warriors emerged from hiding. The Goguryeo forces attacked both sides simultaneously, but their main focus was on the Sui troops who had successfully crossed to the far bank, now isolated, demoralized, and cut off from the bulk of their army. These Sui soldiers, perhaps 30,000 strong, had just watched their comrades die in the thousands. They were in shock, disorganized, and suddenly facing a coordinated assault by warriors who knew the terrain intimately and fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland. The Goguryeo warriors struck with precision and fury. Archers fired from elevated positions, their arrows cutting down Sui officers and creating further chaos in the command structure. Infantry units attacked in coordinated strikes, targeting isolated groups of Sui soldiers and preventing them from reforming defensive positions. The Sui troops on the far bank tried to mount a defense, but they were scattered, leaderless, and psychologically shattered. Many tried to surrender, but in the chaos and fury of battle, quarter was rarely given. Others attempted to swim back across the still raging river and drowned in the attempt. On the near bank, the main body of the Sui army faced its own crisis. Their commanders tried to restore order, but the catastrophe had been so sudden and complete that normal military discipline had broken down. Soldiers questioned whether they should attempt a rescue, try to ford the river elsewhere, or retreat entirely. The decision-making paralysis allowed precious hours to slip away. Meanwhile, General Yulji Mundiak's forces systematically annihilated the isolated Sui troops on the far bank. The battle was less a contest of arms and more a methodical destruction of an already broken force. By nightfall, nearly all 30,000 Sui soldiers who had crossed the river were dead. As darkness fell over the Salsu River, the full scale of the disaster became clear to the surviving Sui commanders. They had lost not just a battle, but a substantial portion of their invasion force in a matter of hours. Morale among the surviving troops was shattered. The logistical situation, already strained, had become desperate. Supply wagons and provisions had been swept away in the flood. The decision was made to retreat. But General Yulji Mundiak had no intention of letting them withdraw in good order. As the Sui army began its retreat, Goguryeo forces launched continuous harassment attacks. They struck at night, targeting supply trains and stragglers. They poisoned water sources along the retreat route. They blocked roads with felled trees and ambushed any unit that tried to clear the obstacles. The Sui retreat became a rout. Discipline broke down completely as units abandoned their wounded and their equipment in desperate attempts to move faster. Disease and starvation took their toll as the army fled through the same territory it had scorched on the way in, now finding no food, no shelter, no respite. Goguryeo cavalry hunted the fleeing army like wolves pursuing wounded prey. They picked off isolated units, captured supply columns, and ensured that the retreat became a cascade of continuous disasters. Of the 300,000 soldiers who had crossed into Goguryeo territory with such confidence months earlier, fewer than 30,000 made it back to Sui territory alive. It was one of the most complete military disasters in human history, a 90% casualty rate. The news of the catastrophe reached the Sui capital like a physical blow. Emperor Yang, who had staked his prestige on this invasion, was devastated. The loss was not just military but political. Rivals at court questioned his judgment, regional governors began to consider rebellion, and the empire's treasury had been drained financing an expedition that had achieved nothing but massive loss of life. The emperor would launch 2 more attempts to conquer Goguryeo in subsequent years, but none would match the scale or ambition of the 612 invasion. Each attempt met with similar resistance and failure, further draining the dynasty's resources and legitimacy. By 618 AD, just 6 years after the Salsu River disaster, the Sui dynasty collapsed in civil war and rebellion. The catastrophic military failures in Goguryeo had been a major contributing factor to the dynasty's fall. Emperor Yang was assassinated by his own officials, and the dynasty that had reunified China disintegrated. The Tang dynasty, which rose from the Sui's ashes, would learn from its predecessors' mistakes. While they would eventually have their own conflicts with Goguryeo's successor states, they approached the Korean peninsula with far more caution and respect. For Goguryeo, the victory at Salsu River secured its independence for another half-century. General Yulji Mundeok became one of Korea's most celebrated military heroes, his tactics studied in military academies for centuries. The battle proved that tactical brilliance and knowledge of terrain could overcome even the most overwhelming numerical superiority. The Salsu River campaign holds several crucial lessons that resonate across military history. First, it demonstrated the power of asymmetric warfare, using unconventional methods to neutralize conventional military advantages. The Goguryeo forces could never have defeated the Sui army in a direct confrontation, so they didn't try. Instead, they transformed the environment itself into a weapon. Second, it showed the danger of overextension. The Sui army was so large that it became logistically unsustainable. Its very size, which was supposed to be its greatest strength, became a fatal vulnerability when supply lines were disrupted and terrain became unfavorable. Third, it illustrated the importance of morale and psychological warfare. The flood didn't just kill Sui soldiers. It shattered the confidence and cohesion of the entire army. The subsequent retreat showed how quickly even a massive force can disintegrate when its soldiers lose faith in their commanders and their mission. Fourth, it proved that patience and strategic deception could be as valuable as military strength. General Yulji Mundeok's willingness to trade space for time, to appear to retreat while actually leading the enemy into a trap, required extraordinary discipline and trust in his plan. Today, the Salsu River flows peacefully through the North Korean countryside, its waters giving no hint of the carnage they once witnessed. The exact location of the battle remains somewhat uncertain. North Korea's isolation has limited modern archaeological investigation, but the historical impact is undeniable. In both North and South Korea, the Battle of Salsu River is taught as a pivotal moment in national history, a symbol of Korean resistance against foreign invasion. General Yulji Mundeok is honored as a national hero, his image appearing on monuments, in textbooks, and in popular culture. Military historians around the world study the battle as a masterclass in defensive warfare and the use of terrain and engineering in military operations. The deliberate damming and release of a river as a weapon of war was not unique in history. Similar tactics had been used in ancient China and would be used again in later conflicts. but never with such devastating effectiveness against such a large force. General Yulji Mundiak stood on the hills above the river 3 days after the battle, watching the swollen waters gradually recede. Bodies and debris still littered the banks. The air was heavy with the smell of death. His warriors were exhausted, tending to their wounded and gathering what could be salvaged from the battlefield. An officer approached and stood silently beside him for a moment before speaking. "They say we killed 270,000. The general didn't respond immediately. He knew the number was probably accurate. The reports from the retreat routes confirmed that very few Sui soldiers had escaped the combination of flood and pursuit. "No," he finally said. "The river killed them. We just opened the door." The officer seemed confused by the distinction. "A victory this complete," the general continued, his voice quiet, "changes things. The Sui will not accept this. They will come again, or someone else will. Our people will tell stories of this battle for generations, and that is good. They should remember what we can achieve when we fight with intelligence rather than just courage. But they should also remember the cost." He gestured toward the river valley, where work crews were beginning the grim task of dealing with the dead. "We won because we were willing to do what was necessary. We sacrificed our own land, burned our own crops, led the enemy through our villages to reach this place. We used the river, a source of life, as an instrument of death. These are not easy choices. Victory is never as simple as the stories make it seem." The officer nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "Will they come again?" he asked. "Perhaps," the general said. "But if they do, they will remember this river. They will remember that Goguryeo is not a prize to be easily taken. They will remember that we fight not just with swords and spears, but with the land itself. And they will hesitate. And in that hesitation, we will find our chance again." As the sun set over the Salsu River, casting long shadows across the battlefield, a new chapter in Korean history began. The kingdoms would continue to fight, dynasties would rise and fall, but the lesson of Salsu River would endure, that a people defending their homeland, armed with courage, intelligence, and intimate knowledge of their land, could defeat even the mightiest empire. The river flowed on, eternal and indifferent, carrying its secrets to the sea. But those who stood on its banks knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when history pivoted on the edge of a blade, when everything hung in balance, and when 5,000 warriors transformed water into the most devastating weapon the ancient world had ever seen. 300,000 soldiers had marched confidently to that river, believing their numbers made them invincible. Only 30,000 returned, carrying with them a story of catastrophe that would topple a dynasty and echo through the centuries as a warning. That size alone does not guarantee victory, that arrogance is a more dangerous enemy than any army, and that those who underestimate their opponent's intelligence do so at their own peril. The Battle of Salsu River stands as a testament to human ingenuity in warfare, to the power of defensive strategy, and to the enduring truth that in war, as in all things, it is not the size of the force that matters, but the wisdom with which it is employed. General Yulji Mundiak and his 5,000 warriors had not just won a battle. They had created a legend that would inspire resistance movements and defensive strategists for over 1,000 years. And the river, which had been their weapon and their salvation, continued its eternal journey, carrying with it the memory of the day when water became death, when patience overcame power, and when 5,000 stood against 300,000 and emerged victorious from the greatest ambush in Asian military history.